In recent weeks, there's been some good news when it comes to fighting the far right, and maybe people have felt slightly more relaxed. Marine Le Pen's National Rally, fascist organisation in France, which looked like it was going to actually win parliamentary power in the most recent elections, ended up running third. The far right was on the streets of Britain in substantial numbers, but the left and the anti-racist forces, anti-fascists, have mobilised and for the moment have largely snuffed out those rallies by the far right. And it's a wonderful thing to see the wheels, at least for the time being, the wheels falling off Donald Trump's campaign in the United States as the rise of the Kamala Harris campaign has really thrown him into complete disarray. But I think we cannot afford to be complacent. The National Rally in France got its largest vote ever. And Marine Le Pen, who was in the runoff for president in the last presidential elections, will almost certainly be in the runoff again, and on the basis of a much larger basis of support than previously. The initial mobilisation on the streets of London by the far right in Britain was 15,000 people. That is not an insignificant number and indicates that the sentiment around the far right, which was also reflected in millions of votes for the so-called Reform Party, is widespread in Britain. And we shouldn't forget that in Italy, the Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, is a fascist. In Hungary, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister, is an anti-Semite. In India, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, is an Islamophobe. And in Argentina, Javier Milei leads a government which is of the far right and dedicated to destroying what exists of the welfare state and working class living standards. And even in Australia, where the far right is much, much smaller than in Europe or in North America, we had the National Socialist Network, open Nazis turning up the Friday before last to try to intimidate the refugee encampment down in the Docklands. So I think there is no room for complacency. I think the first question we have to look at is, why is the far right making ground at this point? They're clearly capitalising on a whole set of racist ideas, but racism is, of course, not new. So why is it the far right is making progress at this point? And I think the first thing is to look as Marxists at the material underpinning of our society and to understand that capitalism has been in essentially a long, drawn-out crisis for the best part of 20 years. In the global south, what were quite vigorous growth rates have trailed away and have led to a situation where we've seen people revolt in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in Kenya, against a system which cannot even begin to deliver the basic needs of ordinary people. And in the advanced nations, the economy has slowed in terms of growth almost to a halt, and at times gone through periods of recession, in particular since the global financial crisis of 2008-2009. And this has had a very real impact on working class people. In Britain, real consumer purchasing power is lower than in 2007. In other words, working class people in Britain are worse off than they were before the global financial crisis. In France, average real wages are currently 3% below the levels of 2019. People are feeling that kind of pressure. And it's interesting when you look at an electoral map of France that the National Rally, the fascist party, traditionally gets its votes in parts of the south and in regional areas. But in the top right-hand corner of France, what used to be the industrial driving force of France, the coal mines, the steel mills in the Pas-de-Calais, virtually every seat has gone to the National Rally, where working class people are looking around and seeing their lives destroyed by a process of deindustrialisation. Similarly in Britain, some of the places where we've heard about the worst of the far-right uprisings, where they've come very close to actually burning refugees alive in the hotels are regions where the coal mines have shut down, the steel mills have shut down, and working class people are hurting. In the United States, there has been, over the last 3 years, a 20% rise in the price of goods and services, and we can be absolutely certain that working class people have not had pay rises of 20%. Real living standards have fallen, and you can actually argue that US working class living standards have been in decline since the 1970s. I looked at the minimum wage in the US in some of the swing states. The swing states will decide the election between Harris and Trump in November. In Pennsylvania, and this is in Australian dollars, in US dollars, of course, it's much lower. In Pennsylvania, the minimum wage is $10.75 an hour. In Georgia, in the Deep South, the minimum wage in Australian dollars is $7.64. That is less than 1/3 of the minimum wage in the United States. And so when Trump stands up and says, "You are in pain and I am your retribution," for many working class people, it feels that their lives are falling to pieces. It feels like the promise that their children's lives will be better than their lives, for the first time in generations, that no longer rings true. People fear that their children will be worse off than they are. And we can see the same thing working its way through in Australia with a per capita recession. What that means is the economy is growing very, very slowly. Population is growing faster. So if you divide the GDP, the wealth produced by the nation, by the population, the average per person is going down in Australia. And of course we know averages disguise the fact that some people are doing very well and lots of workers are suffering. And people on the dole, of course, still live under the poverty line. And we can see some of that anger reflected in particular in the outer working class suburbs of Melbourne and Sydney. There were big swings against the Labor Party in the last elections. And there is a material basis there for the far right to try to break through. So the far right pose as the people who have an answer to this pain. They scapegoat migrants and refugees and people of colour. They offer people an immediate answer, but it's an answer that has an echo inside the official language of the state. We're told there has to be strong border controls. The implication is people coming from outside are a challenge and are a problem. And they try to pose, the far right tries to pose as a radical alternative to the establishment. So in the most recent elections, the National Rally in France, which has already had decades of organising hatred against women who wear the hijab or the niqab or the burqa, argued that anyone with dual nationality should not allowed be access to government jobs. In Britain, Tommy Robinson, who is the leader of the far right, rails against boat people, the few thousand of people who are trying to cross the English Channel out of desperation to get from France to Britain seeking asylum, and calls for mass deportations, which is exactly the slogan that the Nazis here in Melbourne had when they mobilised outside Flinders Street Station a couple of weeks ago. And Trump, whenever he's in trouble, turns to both Islamophobia and to whipping up fear about apparently the waves of migration coming from the South, from Latino people, from Central and Southern America, branding them all as people who have broken out of insane asylums, as rapists and murderers. Now, I think it's really important to say that racism does not come out of a clear blue sky. The ruling class has been pushing racist ideas for many, many years, which legitimise the narrative and the discourse of the far right. The idea that refugees are a danger, that migrants take jobs, all of that has been pushed from the top. And the thing that holds all that together as an ideological glue is Islamophobia. Now, Islamophobia existed from many, many years ago, but it became supercharged, in particular in the 1990s, when Western imperialism decided that they were going to take on and destroy the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, and then they would take on the Taliban in Afghanistan. And we were soaked with the language of the war on terror, the idea that Muslims are terrorists, they're reactionary, they treat women badly, as opposed to Trump supporters who treat women badly in the United States. But what that means is the far right are pushing at an open door. But what they say is the forces of mainstream society talk about dealing with these problems. We will actually deal with these problems. We will actually kick people out of the country. We will stop these brown, black, Muslim peoples from overrunning our society. And so Trump talks about, in the past, draining the swamp, taking on the Washington establishment. He poses himself as the retribution that ordinary people can have. In France, the National Rally posed as friends of the workers when the Macron government raised the pension age, which was a huge attack on working class people. Now, the problem we face is if that was enough, that would be a big problem in itself. But what we see is that these ideas are being enabled by a retreat by social democratic parties. And by social democratic parties, I'm talking about parties that nominally look to the transformation of society. It's extremely nominal, but we're talking about the ALP, we're talking about the Labour Party in Britain, the socialist parties across parts of Western Europe that have a base inside the working class movement, in the Anglo tradition, a base inside the trade union bureaucracy. But those parties have been in retreat for some time, and alongside them, the supposedly progressive pro-worker parties like the US Democrats have also been in retreat. And the reason they've been in retreat is that however much they say that they will offer fairness and an advance for ordinary people, their ultimate loyalty is to their own nation state and to their own national capitalism. And if capitalism is going through a crisis of profitability, if there's been a very low level of growth, then the priority for the social democratic parties is to side with their own capitalists at the expense of working class people. And you can see that being played out right now in front of our faces, with the Labour Party launching an almost unprecedented level of attack on the construction union, using superficial arguments about some corruption here or bikies there, in order to attack a union which is arguably the strongest in the country, that can deliver above inflation pay rises for its members. And these parties also contribute to the ferment of racism from which the far right benefit. Tommy Robinson, the fascist leader, will talk about deportations. The new Labour government, elected just a few months ago in Britain, announced that its priority would be a summer of deportations. And now the equivalent of the Home Affairs Minister in Britain has declared that her target is to deport 14,000 people between now and Christmas. This is coming from a Labour government. And if they say deportations are the way to ease the pain on ordinary people, to get rid of people who are in the country illegally, and by implication who are taking jobs and try to distort society, then it is so much easier for the far right to make that argument. Macron laid the way. He's not a social democrat, but he poses as some kind of sort of Turnbull-style progressive. Macron led the way, attacking the pension age, which is a massive attack on French workers, but also by bringing in an immigration law that was so draconian that Le Pen hailed it as an ideological victory for her party. Now, how do we respond to this situation? I think the first response that most people will have is to vote against the far right. I think we saw that in France just a few months ago. the argument that the left had to give way. They have a complicated voting system. You vote once and then two candidates run off against each other for each seat. And the left went along with the argument, the New Popular Front went along with the argument that where they ran third, they would step down and call on their supporters to vote for Macron's party against the National Rally. We will see the same logic working its way through between now and the November election in the United States, where people will say that Trump is such a threat that even though Kamala Harris is unapologetically a supporter of Israel, has been part of a government over the last 4 years which has presided over a decline in working class living standards, you have to hold your nose and vote for Kamala Harris. Vote for the lesser evil. And a US Marxist by the name of Hal Draper wrote a very important essay about lesser evilism in 1967 in the context of an anti-Vietnam War movement in the United States, where activists were debating, what do we do next? They had a democratic presidency that was supporting the war, but the fear that the Republicans would be even worse, and should they vote for the Democrats, and so on and so forth. And Hal Draper took on the argument head on, and he used another presidential election, one that was held in Germany in 1932, to take on the argument. And in 1932, Hitler stood for the Nazis against von Hindenburg, and von Hindenburg was very much a ruling class figure, a Junker general who represented the right wing of the Weimar Republic. And Hal Draper wrote this about the Social Democrats, who were leading a mass workers' movement, not small like us, leading millions in Germany. They had no doubt about what was practical, realist, hard-headed politics and what was utopian fantasy. So they supported Hindenburg as the obvious lesser evil. They withdrew their candidate in favour of Hindenburg. And so Hal Draper wrote, so the lesser evil, Hindenburg, won, and Hitler was defeated. Whereupon President Hindenburg appointed Hitler to the chancellorship, and in January 1933, the Nazis took over the country. So here in this classic example, he said, people voted for the lesser evil, and they got both. They got the lesser evil of Hindenburg and the greater evil of Nazis, instead of actually fighting for an independent socialist alternative to both of them. And if people vote for Harris, they're voting for the genocide in Palestine, and they're voting for, essentially, as an alternative to mobilising on the streets or in the workplaces as workers, against sexism, against racism, and so on. Where the left withdrew to beat Le Pen in the presidential elections, they called on their supporters to vote for candidates like the former Macron Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne, who was one of the authors of the attacks on the pension age. They called on their supporters to vote for the Interior Minister Gerald Darmanin, who had rammed through some of the most racist laws of the Macron government, and who had previously written for an anti-Semitic organisation called Action Française. When the left comes in behind either Harris or Macron, or you can multiply the examples, firstly they imply that they are a bulwark against the far right, when the real bulwark is the mass mobilisation of workers from below. And secondly, they allow the far right to say about the left, look, they're part of the establishment. They are with Macron. They are with Harris. We are the real fighters against the system. We are the revolutionaries. So we look to struggle from below as the fundamental way in which we can drive back the far right. That includes campaigning against votes for the far right. Nearly 20 years ago, the forerunner of Solidarity played an important role up and down the country in mobilising thousands of people behind a campaign to say, put One Nation and Pauline Hanson last. It was a very important intervention to try and slow down what was then a One Nation juggernaut. But we need to look at the potential for strikes and revolts from below. It undercuts the people, the Macrons and Harrises of this world, who have no interest in working people fighting for their own interests, but it also undercuts the far right, who pretend to be on the side of workers but are not. So to do this, we have to do two things. And I apologise to anybody on the left who finds it difficult to think about two things simultaneously. Most people just go for one option. We have to do two things, and we have to do two things simultaneously. We have to unite with anybody who is prepared to stand up against the far right. And they could be Greens members or supporters. They could be Labour Party members and supporters. They could be union officials who in other circumstances don't have a very good track record. But we need to unite revolutionaries and reformists together to form a bulwark against the far right. At the end of the day, Hitler could have been stopped if the socialists and the communists in Germany had united, not just electorally, but on the streets in revolutionary uprising. The working class could have stopped Hitler in a way that voting for Hindenburg could never done. But at the same time, it is vitally important that we also build a left alternative that can give people hope again around the misery. That actually when people say life is falling to pieces, the far right says if we kick out the migrants, I think life will be better. We're the people who have to say, if we mobilise as workers, if we mobilise as the working class, we can build a better society. Black, white, Asian, we can unite against the bosses who are the real source of our misery. So the united front against the far right involves revolutionaries uniting with reformists. Building a socialist alternative that can challenge capitalism and pave the way for a revolt against capitalism involves building a revolutionary party and winning reformists over to the cause of revolutionary organisation. So in conclusion, to understand what's going on, to build a fight against the far right, and to build a fight for a socialist society that can offer real hope to working class people, where they feel a sense of their own power, and racism is discarded into the dustbin of history. For all of that, we need one simple thing. We need to build revolutionary socialist organisation today.